Welcome to this week's Who the Folk podcast. I'm Lonnie Goldsmith, the editor of TC Jew Folk, and we are back from a little late summer hiatus to talk to Ron Krebs, a distinguished McKnight University professor and a professor of political science at the University of Minnesota. We talk about what it's like to teach about global political and military events as they're happening in real time, what led Ron to academia, and a little bit on what could be a challenging start to the school year on campus on this week's Who the Folk podcast. But before we hear from Ron, this week's Who the Folk podcast is sponsored by the Minnesota Jewish Community Foundation, celebrating half a century of impact, advising individuals, families, and nonprofits on charitable giving and endowments. Visit mnjcf.org to start giving your way. Professor Ron Krebs, welcome to the Who the Folk podcast. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me, Lonnie.
You are a professor of political science at the University of Minnesota, but your areas of expertise are things like foreign policy, military recruitment and service, civil military relations, and we are approximately 9 weeks from from election day, and certainly sooner before folks here in Minnesota can start voting. And of course, there's no shortage of global, military things to talk about. So I think it's a really interesting time to have you on. When there are things like this happening around the world, how does it feel like particularly crazy for you in terms of like work and all of these things happening in real time that you get to teach about?
So I started teaching at the University of Minnesota in the fall of 2002. And you will remember, and your listeners will remember, that we were kind of gearing up for war in Iraq at that time. And I taught my Introduction to Global Politics class for the very first time in the spring of 2003. And students take courses in political science, and specifically in my field of international relations, precisely because they care about the world and want to make sense of the world. And also sometimes because it just fits in their schedule and it satisfies some distribution requirement. Let's get real.
Sure, absolutely, no question.
Many of them want to make sense of the world. And so that's always very challenging. My first term teaching, I changed my syllabus 4 times. Based on my course reviews that year, I can tell you I learned in my very first semester of teaching, students really hate that. But what they do really appreciate is the ways in which, they can understand how the ideas that we are playing with in our classes and the history we're examining could be ripped from the headlines and relates to the world around them. Last year, when the war in Gaza broke out, I was teaching my course that I'm teaching this semester on international conflict and security. In the spring, I taught a course on the consequences of war. I leaned into the war in Gaza. It was like perfectly lined up for everything that we were teaching. And I will tell you, despite all the craziness going on our campus and others, unlike many colleagues, I leaned into the Gaza war and I found students eager to learn and eager to talk.
So I think one of the things that's I found slightly frustrating at times in hearing people talk about not just the war in Gaza, and we can certainly talk more about that, but I think a lot of times with respect to global conflict, there is the lack of nuance and willing to have a substantive discussion. It's, very, people just want to know why. They want the bumper sticker answer to something. How are you finding today's students? And I sound like such an old person saying it that way, but how do you find that's today's students, the students that you deal with on a daily basis, starting this week as people are listening to this, how are they responding to that kind of real-time discussion and debate and understanding of what's going on?
So I think that what students sometimes want from me, and therefore find very frustrating, is that they want me just to tell them, what should I think? They want to know, what does Krebs think? And therefore, what should I think? And sometimes, of course, they want that bumper sticker version. And sometimes they want to be confirmed in what it is that they think that they know. But I think really in my experience, Lonnie, how students behave in the classroom is very different than when they are out there in the quad protesting. Even the very same students And there's, I think, maybe I'm a naive, maybe I'm just an idealist, but I've been around. I don't think I'm idealistic about students. I've been teaching for far too long. But I had I had Jewish students in my class in the consequences of war. I had 4 students who wore a hijab. And my students who were Somali in origin, they certainly were sympathetic to fellow Muslims, but we approached it analytically, and they were deeply aware of how little they knew. One of the things that I find very frustrating, I think I share with you, is that colleagues who never tire of complexifying, who cannot write their way out of a paper bag when it comes to their own area of research, somehow find global politics an area of simple black hats and white hats, of simple Manichaean morality. And of course it isn't. And because I did shy away, I'm not going to tell you in my class, as I always tell students, I'm not going to tell you what to think, and I'm not going to tell you what values to hold. I'm going to tell you what questions to ask. And that is what we do in my class. And students want that.
So I guess the good thing about the classes that you're teaching and the way the courses have lined up around, things like Gaza, is that you've done it before. You have experience of having to try and teach and tweak a syllabus and do this all in real time. So like going back to 2003 when US invaded Iraq in March of that year, if memory serves, the sources were a little bit different in terms of like the information flow. There wasn't as much real-time reporting because there's no social media back then. As social media has increased for better or worse, is that making things easier in terms of how you go about teaching and discussing the topics of the day?
I think that, we are facing, speaking of sounding like an old fogey, I'm going to sound like an old fogey, right? Over my 2 decades of teaching at the University of Minnesota, I think there is no question that students never like to read. They like to read even less. And they get their news now in sound bites. But, in the 2000s, they got their news from Jon Stewart. That was also a kind of a sound bite. They were, they regularly watched The Daily Show, and that was part of something I had to watch The Daily Show so I would understand what they knew about the world. Here's something that's revealing. I always tell students, I'll try to come to class 10, 15 minutes early so we can talk about the news and put the real world, real world in context. And I discovered that I have to be very careful about that because students don't ask me about what happened 2 days ago or yesterday so I can actually have read about it and put it in context. They're asking me what came up on their phone 5 minutes ago. And that's really hard because I have no context for that. But we don't have to go back to 2003. Before the Gaza war, it was Ukraine in February of 2022. I was again teaching my course on conflict and security, and it was like I had paid off Vladimir Putin. Week after week, it was like ripped from the headlines. You want to know how not to fight a war? You want to know the problems of combined arms? We have a problem for you. The Russians are giving us a perfect example. Sanctions, economic sanctions is another week I talk about. What works, what doesn't work? And lo and behold, we had real-time examples. So, I think that students really appreciate and understand that what we're doing is not merely abstruse. It isn't something that is just about World War I, though we do study World War I. So we actually have a relatively full documentary record. So we can actually are not simply reproducing our priors, our assumptions, but they can see why this matters to the world around them. And that's why I love teaching it. That's why it's exciting.
Like for lots of reasons, but I'm sure it would be nice for you if some of this stuff would maybe like simmer down so you could actually stick to, a syllabus and not have to worry about changing on the fly. Or is that an assumption on my part? And that kind of working on the run is fun for you?
So back at the end of the Cold War, at the dawn of the post-Cold War age, a public intellectual named Francis Fukuyama wrote a famous or infamous article called The End of History. And Fukuyama proclaimed that there were no longer ideological conflicts. Liberalism had won. Small L liberalism, not, that is to say, democracy, belief in free markets, rights of the individual, everything that we prize in the West. And Fukuyama said this with a certain sense of regret. That is to say that a world where there is no ideological conflict is a very boring world. Well, here's what I have to say. I guess I'd be very happy if I were put out of a job, but I'm really not very worried about it.
No, I wouldn't be either. And I feel like Fukuyama maybe kind of sort of jumped the gun a little bit.
Just a little.
Maybe a little bit of a prisoner of the moment, which I suppose back in that era, I guess that would have been right about 1994, right? Like that made sense a little bit, that
I
point
mean,
of view.
Fukuyama, to be clear, not that we need the history lesson right
No,
now,
it's
Fukuyama did not think conflict would come to an end. He just thought it was all going to be petty nationalist conflict, not grand ideological alternatives to liberalism. Fukuyama himself has since written books on both nationalist conflict and communal conflict and the perils of the difficulties of state building. So I think he's come to understand the world ain't so boring, even, and liberalism does not, of course, have the field to itself. And some of the greatest pushback that we've seen against small L liberalism has ironically come from within the West. This is to say, the populist nationalist epitomized by Viktor Orban in Hungary, by Bibi Netanyahu in Israel, by Modi in India, by Marine Le Pen in France, and by Donald Trump in the United States, and on and on.
well, there are certainly no shortage of examples, for better or worse, of such nationalism. You know, one of the things you had mentioned was the protests and the encampments that took place on campus. And you know, as we are on the cusp of a new school year starting, we've had a summer of things being fairly quiet since nobody was around on the college campuses. What are you expecting to see, I guess, specifically at the U, and maybe if you're paying attention to uh, the larger field of this kind of protest, what you think you might see as the new school year starts?
Well, I think everybody, right? I think that it doesn't matter, quote unquote, which side you're on. I think everybody had been hoping that this war would be over the summer. We were hoping it would be over well before that. It hasn't happened. It's not going to happen. And so I think that, you know, if there's any reason that President Shafiq of Colombia resigned, I think it's because she saw that the war was not coming to an end and she wouldn't be able to do her job. Across the country, there is an expectation that the protests will resume, and universities around the country have been trying to get ahead of that, much to their regret. They're having to get ahead of that by articulating clearer boundaries and standards as to what behavior is and is not consistent with the university rules and procedures. We have not actually had any official pronouncement yet from the University of Minnesota. However, the upcoming meeting is coming tomorrow of the Board of Regents. That document does in fact have a proposal that the regents are, I think, going to be asked to vote on from the university administration, setting out how they will deal with communicating the university's expectations and what happens if those on campus violate those expectations and those procedures. Everything at the end of the day is going to come down to enforcement, of course, and whether they follow through on what they say. And that, of course, remains to be seen. But I think that there is I have every expectation that we will again see protests on the University of Minnesota campus. And frankly, I think that we should, in the sense that if students feel passionately about things, there should be, and there is space for them to exercise their academic freedom and their free speech rights. Those are, I use both those expressions because they are not the same thing that people often think they are. But they need to do so within the time, manner, and place restrictions as articulated by the university, which is very much content neutral. And students and faculty and so on need to do that. So I think that there should be protests because people feel passionately, and that's very important, that they should be able to express themselves. But you know, I can only hope that the university administration has a very good plan for what happens when people do not obey the guidelines that the university has set up.
And as the meeting took place last week, as you are listening to this, we will have links to our article on TC Jufok from that meeting in the show notes and in the article page, so you can catch up on the big news from that meeting. This is what greets a brand new president who is started back in July at the turn of the academic year. So it'll be a really interesting, I think, for a lot of people to watch how President Cunningham is going to approach this. And I think for both those of us outside the campus, and people like yourself who are right in the middle of it.
Well, I'm optimistic. I have not had any contact with President Cunningham, but I am optimistic because she has been a longtime senior administrator at the University of Michigan. And of course, they had their own challenges last year. And so she was at the center of those discussions. She is not inexperienced in this regard. Many people were blindsided last year. And I think the University of Minnesota, as grateful as we were to interim President Ettinger for stepping in for that year after the departure of President Gable, interim President Ettinger came from the corporate world. He was not familiar with exactly how universities function. And so we were, I think, particularly poorly positioned to handle the circumstances that the administration then found itself faced with.
I know something that's happening, or there's concerns of happening, is around at other campuses is academic boycotts around this particular topic. Is that something you're concerned about? And what do you see as the real danger to academia in general because of that?
Yeah, that's a really important question. So maybe we should talk about what an academic boycott is, because I think many listeners may not understand.
Please, that'd be great.
No one requires anybody, right? To be clear, nobody requires anybody to collaborate with people they don't want to collaborate with, to collaborate with people they find distasteful. That's the boycott of an academic, and one is welcome to do that. What we're talking about here are systematic boycotts of institutions, either because of their own policies or because of the policies of their country. And therefore, there is, as there has been for now well over 20 years, discussion about boycotting Israeli institutions of higher education, which of course would have implications, we shouldn't kid ourselves, for the individuals themselves. Now, to be clear, so I've actually been quite involved in this. I just 2.5 weeks ago, the American Association of University Professors, which is not only a leading American institution, but a leading global institution, the institution that back in 1915 basically invents the concept of academic freedom and has long fought valiantly against oppressive university administrations in favor of academic freedom. And that 20 years ago took amidst another war with Palestinian militants, the American Association of University Professors forthrightly said that academic boycotts of Israelis or anybody else are at odds with the values and mission of the university. 2.5 weeks ago, the association, the AAUP, its committee on academic freedom, as then its governing council, approved the essentially normalized academic boycotts as a tactic and said these are basically legitimate tactics to try to produce political change. I had already been in conversation with some colleagues. We'd already started drafting a statement to try to get folks to sign on that was not focused on Israel per se, but focused on the principles of academic freedom. We immediately pivoted. We got a letter out to our global community of scholars, and within less than a week, 3,000 scholars signed on opposing the view of the AAUP. We are now up to just a few days later. So this was as of last Thursday, was a week. Here we are on the following Monday. So it's 10 days later. We're at about 3,300 and 3,400 and growing. And we would like there to be thousands of people to say that ultimately academic boycotts are at odds with the spirit and mission of the university. And they're at odds with the spirit of the mission and university for a number of really fundamental reasons. At the heart of the conception of academic freedom is the idea that what really matters to progress and advance in scholarly knowledge is the free circulation of knowledge as much as possible. And academic boycotts, and therefore the only way to judge, the only value judge of scholarly merit is the substance of the scholarship itself, not the identity of the individual who is responsible for that scholarship. Academic boycotts are at odds with that. They introduce extramural political considerations that limit the circulation of academic ideas and scholarly knowledge. And beyond that, they actually say that the merit of scholarship is greater or lesser depending on who authors it. This is fundamentally at odds with the mission of the university. And I am as opposed to boycotts of Russian and Iranian academics as I am to Israeli academics. And I think this is deeply problematic and that it is really very, very dangerous. And I think that the AAUP has not considered the unintended second-order consequences of this. However, the reality is that people were boycotting Israeli academics or Russian academics when it was the AAUP's policy that there should not be academic boycotts, because academics can do what they want to do. The AAUP has no real say, it has no real power. But it is important to maintain disciplinary norms. And this is where I think the AAUP's new policy really does matter. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us to resist it as much as possible.
A pretty profound passion for academia. I was curious, what was it that got you into being a professor in the first place?
Well, I certainly don't come from a world of professors. Both my parents are the first in their family to go to college, and both of their older siblings did not go to university. Both my parents are Holocaust survivors. They survived the war as children. They came to the United States and Canada as teenagers or younger. Their older siblings were too old and went straight into the workforce. So I certainly did not come from a world where we understood what the academy meant. But of course, like many of your listeners, came from a home with tremendous respect for scholarship. And when I told my father that I wanted to do a PhD and didn't want to go to law school, as he'd been hoping, he was both very proud and very nervous, all at the same time. But I think there's no question that the world in which I grew up, right, this is a world where we lived global politics. My parents had been essentially, if you will, post-war refugees. Not only that, my parents, and I can say this now only because they are deceased, my parents were illegal immigrants. It was something that it was a big family secret. We didn't talk about it because they lied in order to get visas to the United States and Canada. Specifically, they'd survived the war on both sides in the Soviet Union. They were Polish Jews who fled east. And they lied because in the age of McCarthy, nobody wanted to admit to having had anything to do with the Soviet Union during the war. There's no way that you would have gotten a visa at that time. At least that is what was going around the communities where they lived at the time. My father was in DP camps, displaced persons camps in southern Germany. My mother's family was in Belgium at the time. And that was the general wisdom. Don't admit to having anything to do with the Soviet Union. Oh, and pretend to be younger than you actually are if you're a middle-aged man. And so my grandfather had to work to 75 to get Social Security. So this was a huge family secret. And so we lived global politics, right? I mean, their status as illegal immigrants weighed on them almost to their dying day because they really feared, this is honest, they feared deportation. And so we had family all over the world. We understood the consequences of war in a way that I think that was merely an abstraction for many others, and to some degree, of course, an abstraction for me, since I grew up in relative privilege in northern New Jersey. But I think that I simply grew up in an environment suffused with that experience, and that meant that when I went off to college, I was torn between political science and chemistry. And chemistry fell by the wayside after my first semester, and then it was politics and history all the way.
I'm always interested how people get to where they are, not just, you go to school, you go to more school, you get a master's, get a doctorate, not that piece of it, but sort of like the why. And I think the why of how you got to this particular, not just academia, but this particular career path within academia, I mean, you clearly come by it very honestly. There is such close, deep family tie to that it makes sense.
My family grew up, if you will, in the shadow of war. My field of international relations, I teach a lot about the causes of war. The field essentially is born more or less in an attempt to prevent World War I and World War II from happening again, right? So there's a lot of attention paid to the causes of war. But I think there's no accident that I have studied the consequences of war, because I grew up with the fingerprints of war all over social interactions, personal interactions, psychology, interests, the kind of literature we read as a family, right? I grew up in the shadow of a war that took place that had ended almost 30 years before I was born.
Yeah.
And yet its shadow loomed large over my family.
And I think you are probably, one of many families for whom that was the case, that helped steer your path, or, the path of, contemporaries, because of that experience and that background.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's actually allowed me to identify, we have, as our listeners know, we have the largest Somali population here in the United States, here in the Twin Cities. We have a very large Hmong population, one of the two largest in the United States. These are also many of my students in my classroom grew up in the shadow of war. And so that's something that we can bond over. Increasingly not for them, but for their parents, right? Because there are fewer and fewer of my students who themselves grew up in Somalia. But again, the shadow of the Somali civil war, the shadow of the Hmong having been allies of the United States during the Vietnam War, it looms over their families just as it loomed over mine.
Well, I would love to get more into some of the causation that you mentioned, but we don't have nearly enough time for that. So on that note, I'm going to wrap up on the last two questions we always end on. First, Ron, what is your favorite Jewish holiday?
Oh, that's a great question. My favorite Jewish holiday, I think, without a doubt, is Passover. It's my favorite Jewish holiday, if you will, not only for the reasons that lots of people have, right? Because family comes together and we've got all the special foods that we all have enjoyed since we were little. But for me, it's also the most political of Jewish holidays. The great political theorist Michael Walzer, who's a very serious, committed Jew, as well as a great political theorist, wrote a book that I commend to all of our listeners if they've not read it, called Exodus and Liberation. And there is no moment, there's almost no moment in history that has been so inspiring to so many people around the world as the story of the Exodus. It is the most political of holidays. And so as a political scientist, I cannot but appreciate Passover and have myself given more than one Devar Torah, more than one sermon about the intersection of politics and Passover.
I feel like we're going to have to talk about that a whole other time also, but I'll keep you around to see if maybe you want to write something about that come that time of year. Also, now the last question, what is your favorite Jewish food?
So my favorite Jewish food, which I think betrays my European origins. I grew up in a very European household. Actually, my favorite Jewish food is actually fruit kompot. It's just basically melted down fruit, and and when you cook fruit, it brings out the sugars so powerfully. And so that is something that, my mother used to make all the time. And I just grew up having fruit kompot by the barrelful. So that is, I think nothing, something that your younger listeners would not even say, what the heck is that? But to me, growing up in a very European home, that is really my favorite Jewish food.
That is fantastic. Ron Krebs, professor of political science at the University of Minnesota. Thank you so much for joining us this week. Lots that you talked about that have some very, very real world applications as we are living in this moment. So thank you for joining us, and happy first day of school.
My pleasure. Thank you. And we certainly need the good wishes, as it will be undoubtedly a fraught start to the school year, as it was a fraught year all of last year.
Indeed. Thanks so much. The Who the Folk podcast is a part of the Jew Folk Podcast Network and a product of Jew Folk Inc. Please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you get your podcasts. If you have suggestions for other podcast guests, please email them to me at editor@tcjewfolk.com. For our other shows, check out tcjewfolk.com/podcast.